2 Samuel chapter 14. And you'll remember that a couple of chapters back, we had David making the biggest mistake of his life. Where on the top of his palace, he saw a woman, desired her, contacted her, she came to him, and now David has begun to pay for that. We saw last week how David's own his own daughter, Tamar, was raped by her brother. And then we saw how Tamar's brother, Absalom, took vengeance on the oldest brother, Amnon, and after 2 years of plotting and planning, actually had him killed. And then he left and he fled. 3 years he's been away. And so as we pick up chapter 14 tonight, what we see is Absalom's been gone for 3 years. Now, to understand what's happening in this chapter, we have to look at David's position as king. As the king, he is the upholder from God's perspective and from the people's perspective of the will and the plans and the laws of God. And so David had no choice but to have allowed his son to be gone, because if he came back, David would have had to allow judgment to be executed on him for having killed Amnon. And they had these rules back in those days, they had people they called the Avenger of Blood, which would have been the nearest relative to somebody who had been killed. And if you look back to the Levitical law, there seems to be an implication that the person who was the Avenger of Blood could legitimately kill a person who had taken the life of their loved one without any recriminations. Now, we can't do that in our society today. That person would get locked up and they would find kind of equal justice for themselves. But in the Bible times, they had that law, and they even established cities where a person who accidentally killed somebody, they could go to this city. It was called a city of refuge. And if it was determined that it was, in fact, an accident that had resulted in the other person's death, then they were allowed to live in that city until the death of the high priest, who was the high priest at that time. If they left that city, the city of refuge, even though they had been proven innocent, if they left that city of refuge while the high priest, that was high priest when it happened, was still in office, then the Avenger of Blood could legally and legitimately kill them. And so with that as a background, we have to understand that David, not only was David and the Avenger of Blood for his son Amnon, but some of the other brothers would have also been the next of kin. David had to uphold the law, and so his son Absalom was some distance away, and yet David longed for his son. He wanted to have his son Absalom back with him. And so in verse 1 of chapter 14, it says, Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. And as I was reading this, I found this fascinating today. David was unable to make an exception in the case of Absalom, because it would have looked like he was favoring him. Does that make sense to you? He couldn't bring Absalom back and let him live, because people would have said, why, he did that because that's his son. And so Joab had to put together something where David could see that what he needed to do was okay to do. And so what Joab did was he went to a town called Tekoa, and he found a wise woman there. And as I studied about this woman today, I found it fascinating that there is some thought that she may have actually been in the position that she describes. It may not have been a ruse. Joab may have found somebody who not only was elderly to appeal to David's heart, but also someone who was actually in the situation where one of her sons had killed another, and people wanted to take this living son's life and wipe out her heirs from the earth. And so when she came to David, Joab had said, here, this is what I want you to say to the king. So she went to the king. And in those days, what they would do the king would hold court or give judgments early in the morning. It was kind of a habit of kings in that day and time. And so early in the morning, maybe even out at the city gate, the king would be sitting there, and people would come and they would stand in front of him and they would say, "This is my problem." And he would say, "Okay, well, I'll do this about it, or I'll do that about it." And so this woman comes. She's dressed in clothes like she's really upset, and she doesn't have any lotion on. She's acting and looking like she's been grieving for the dead for a long time. And so she comes to the king, and the king says, "What's troubling you?" Because she keeps saying, "Help me, your majesty." Well, David has a kind heart. And so David's like, "Okay, what's the problem?" She describes the problem. She's a widow. Her husband's dead. She had 2 sons. They got into a fight, and nobody was there to separate them. Some of you may have had children like that. They get into a fight, and if there's nobody there to separate them, they might kill each other. I remember one time when my brother and I got in a fight, and I ended up on his back. He was on his belly on the ground, and I had his foot, and I was twisting his toe backwards. Brothers can be pretty intense, you know. And so she's describing a situation that David understood, because David had raised boys. He had boys. And so these two get in a fight. There's nobody there to separate them, and one of them killed the other one. So her whole clan is rising up saying, "We need to kill him because he killed your other son," which means now she has no heir. She has nobody to take care of her in her old age. And so it appealed to David. And so David said, "Go home. I'll issue an order on your behalf." Now this lady was nobody. She had come in. David had never met her. From what we read here, he had never met her ever before. And she came in, presented her problem, and David said, "Okay, I'll take care of it." Well, she goes on. She wants to drive the point home. And she says, "Let my lord the king pardon me and my family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." And the king says, "Well, listen, if anybody says anything to you, bring them to me. They won't bother you anymore." And then she goes on, and she just kind of, and this sounds weird to us because we make a statement, we ask a request, somebody answers it, but they kind of go back over things over and over again. So now again she says, "Let the king invoke the Lord God to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so my son will not be destroyed." Well, David responds. He says, "As surely as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground." At this point now, I can see the woman, she kind of looks at David and she's like, you ever hear somebody in the military and they say something like, "Permission to speak freely"? That's kind of what she says here. She says, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." Well, now she's been speaking. So this is a change in tone. And he says, "Speak." She said, "Why then?" He had just given her this grace and said, "I will take care of this. They're not going to do that to your son. Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God?" Now what she's doing is she's drawing a parallel between what she just said and what has gone on. Absalom was a good-looking guy. He was, actually David, it seems like either David was a good-looking guy himself, or he always chose good-looking women as his wives, or maybe it was both, because we hear about David's sons being really handsome guys and his daughters being really beautiful women. And so the people of Israel were looking to, David's getting older. And by this point in time, David is probably mid-50s. He's probably shown his age just a little bit, and they realize he's not going to be king forever. And so they're looking to who's going to be the next king. Oh, there's that good-looking guy, Absalom. And so, but he's gone. There was this terrible thing, and people have been talking. People in Israel had talked, just like people around here would talk. And they had heard the story. And from our perspective, even though we realize that a human being is not the judge and executioner, after what Amnon did to Tamar, he kind of had it coming. And the people of Israel would have been thinking the same thing. And so they're thinking, the king won't let Absalom come back. He's the next one in line for the throne now that Amnon's gone. And so that's why she draws this parallel here. And she says, when the king says this, does he not convict himself For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so he must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I'll speak to the king, perhaps he'll grant your servant's request. This is what makes me think that she may have been actually in that situation, and Joab very wisely picked this woman because she would be a real illustration to David of what needed to happen. So, David says this. Now, again, this is kind of that Middle Eastern way of dealing with things. He says, don't keep from me the answer that I'm about to ask you. And she's like, well, let my lord the king speak. And the king says, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all of this? Now, you'll remember that I mentioned to you before, Joab has done some things that are despicable. He's already killed one man, Abner, who was trying to bring all of Israel over to David. And Joab, because Abner had killed his brother, Joab killed him. Joab is kind of unscrupulous. He does what he needs to, but Joab is good for King David. And so Joab knows what's going on, and he knows that the king wants him to get his own son back, but he's unable to do so because of his royal position. And so he has sent this woman, and so he's like, yeah, there's Joab behind this. And look what she says. She says, as surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this, and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My lord has the wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land. She's kind of buttering him up. You know, that's the way they did. They talked like that in those days. And he's like, okay. And it's almost like Joab, and either Joab was there when the woman came, maybe he was standing, you know, and maybe they're out by the gates of the city, and he's having his court there, and the woman's standing in front of him, and Joab's standing over there kind of listening but not listening. You know how that goes. And so David turns to him and says, okay, very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom. Now, it seems like at this point, but Joab was sincere in just wanting to help the king. It's not like he's buddy-buddy with Absalom, because he goes and he brings Absalom back, but David says, okay, he can come back, but he's not going to see my face. He's going to live in his own house, but he's not going to come and see me. And so Absalom comes back, and he's there for 2 years in Jerusalem. He'd been away 3 years, and now he's back for 2 years, never seeing the king's face. Well, Absalom's like, hey, if I'm guilty, kill me, but I want to see my dad. Now, I have to be honest with you. I know what's coming in the next chapter, and I have to question Absalom at this point. Absalom was as devious as he was handsome. He was as conniving, and he was as self-focused as he was good-looking. I don't know if he really wanted to see his dad, or if he's pushing the issue because he can't do what has been growing in his heart if he's not allowed in the capital city of Jerusalem. And so he sends messengers to Joab to say, hey, come on, I want to see my dad. And Joab ignores him. That's why I don't think there was any special connection between Joab and Absalom. I think Joab actually did this for David's benefit. But finally, after Joab wouldn't listen to him, Absalom says to his servants, okay, that's Joab's field out there. Go out there and set it on fire. So his field's burning, and Joab shows up on Absalom's doorstep. It's like, why did you tell your servants to burn my field? He said, because you wouldn't come talk to me. Aren't you glad you don't have neighbors like that? Just talk to your neighbors, okay? You know, if you're like me, though, I don't know, maybe the rest of you are not like this. But I had new neighbors, my neighbors that have been next door to me for the last 4.5 years. I never met them. That's a shame. I need to be ashamed of myself. I'm not going to make that mistake with our new neighbors. We have new neighbors that moved in. I've already met them. Talked to them already. We've got some more neighbors who are going to move in across the street. And once they get moved in, we're going to invite both families over to our house. So it's a good thing to know your neighbors and to talk to your neighbors. That way they're not going to burn your field down. I would encourage you. I have a friend who lives over in the Ivy Hill subdivision, real nice subdivision over there. And she really feels like that God put them where they are for a purpose, to minister. And so within a year of when they moved into their house, they had invited all the neighbors on the street over to their house for dinner. And they've done it a couple of times now because they really feel like they want to connect. Well, so Joab and Absalom had this problem. And so anyway, he burns his field, and Joab finally comes. So Joab goes to the king, and the king summons Absalom, and it says he came in, bowed down with his face to the ground, and the king kissed Absalom. David loved Absalom. David loved his kids. Have you ever met someone who was a parent who loved their kids, but they didn't love them with discipline? You ever met parents like that? That was David. There are several places where there's a statement that this particular son was doing something, and David never said anything to them about it. David never questioned them. David never called them to account as a result of it. And I mean, part of me kind of understands that. You know, if you had, I mean, guys, just stop and think. If you have children, what if you had 30 wives, and every one of them had 2 or 3 or 4 children? Now that's, I mean, you're talking 30 wives, even if they had 2 apiece, that's 60 kids. You might not even remember all their names, you know? And so maybe we can cut David some slack, but Absalom was now his oldest son, and David had not taken any corrective measures with him. And so when we come into chapter 15, it says in the course of time, and if you have any kind of headings with your Bible, you know what's coming, because there's a little heading there that says Absalom's conspiracy. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. Now, this is not unusual. That's the kind of thing that a prince would do. The kind of thing that a guy would do who's going to be the next king of the country would kind of get around. I mean, you know, to go somewhere, that's a big deal. It's kind of like, you know, the vice president, when he goes somewhere, he's always got a motorcade, and he's got all kinds of bodyguards. And you'd expect that for the king, but that's the kind of thing we got here with this prince, Absalom. But he got up early. Remember I mentioned to you when the lady came to him with an issue, that David might have been out at a gate, and early in the morning is when they kind of rendered their judgments. Well, it seems like what Absalom's doing is he's taking advantage of some, I don't want to say, well, yeah, maybe faults of David. We have to understand that our perception of how a government is set up, it was not their perception. Saul's kingdom had been a very loose connection, and it gradually got more and more cohesive as time went on with Saul. But when David took over, there was not a very strong national consciousness, if you will. And so some of the things that I'm going to share with you here, I was reading one of the commentators this afternoon, and he asked a question, and that was this: why was Absalom able to get all kinds of people across Israel to get on board with the rebellion? What was wrong with David's kingdom? What dissatisfaction was there? And so there are several things I want to share with you why his rebellion had a chance. It could very well have been that David was getting older. He may have been 55, 60 by this time. And actually says that he went on at this for about 4 years. So he had been away for 3 years, came back, stayed away from David for 2 years, another 4 years. So if David were 50 when he had committed his sin with Bathsheba, this all happened after that. So David's at least 59, 60 years old. And so it's very possible that he wasn't as energetic as he was previously. You're going to find a couple of chapters from now, David's out on the battlefield, and he's going up against one of the relatives of Goliath, and he's about to get killed when one of his men comes to his aid and takes out the giant, and then they turn to David, and they're like, you're not going to battle with us anymore. And David had gotten old enough that he wasn't as good. Now, and I find that really strange when I contrast, because I look at Saul, who physically, Saul was still able-bodied, wielding a sword, spear, and everything else at 70 years of age. When we see David at 70 years of age, he's in bed and can't stay warm, and he's got to have a new wife to lay down next to him to keep him warm. What a difference in their physical makeup. So David may have been kind of deteriorating just a little bit here, which could account for why there was some dissatisfaction. Secondly, he may not have properly appointed judges throughout the land. Thirdly, another reason might have been because Joab's power was kind of spreading, and that's not uncommon. Abner did it with Ishbosheth. Very possible that Joab's doing the same thing here. There could have been some people that were still kind of thinking, Saul was the first king, and we need to get Saul's family back in here, not David. Of course, we do know for a fact David was, although he was right with God again, God wasn't happy with what had happened, and God said, hey, there's going to be some bad things that are going to be coming. There are always people that are going to cause trouble, and Absalom was, by the way, the real and undisputed heir to the throne. So all of that, and the fact that David was getting older, and they knew that eventually, most people, when it comes to organizations, are more interested in the sunrise than the sunset. And they're looking for what's going to come next. They may have been looking for Absalom and what was going to go on next. And so as we look at this, it makes sense that this was going to happen. But now what he would do is, as people were lined up waiting to see the king, if the king were not able to stay for long periods of time and give out these judgments, people were waiting sometimes maybe for days on end. So here's what Absalom would do. Now, he's a good-looking guy. He's one of the nicest-looking ones in the land. There's not a blemish on him. And so the people would be coming. He's up early, and he's out around the gate where Dad was over there. Dad's doing his thing, and he's administering the justice and so on, and giving out these divine decrees. But Absalom's catching the people that are waiting in line, and they've been there for a long time. And he's like, I wish somebody could take care of your issue. And he's appealing to their dissatisfaction because David's not able to handle it. And so they would start to bow down to him. And this good-looking guy, what he would do, he would reach down and grab him and say, oh, no, don't bow. And he would raise him up, and he'd wrap his arms around him and give him a big hug. This happened. This went on for 4 years. And David didn't see it. David didn't have a clue. He was clueless. And so at the end of 4 years, it says that he goes to his dad and he says, let me go to Hebron. I need to fulfill a vow that I made to the Lord. Now, we don't know if Absalom had any faith whatsoever in Jehovah. He is trying to make his dad think that he does. Oh, when I was away, Dad, I made this vow to God, and I need to go down to Hebron. I need to fulfill that vow. All along, what's been going on in Absalom's heart is that the bitterness that crept into him after what Amnon did to his sister, and the fact that David said nothing and did nothing to Amnon because of it, that bitterness grew to the point that he took Amnon's life. But now he's been away 3 years, back for 2 years, and he's been plotting for 4 years. This bitterness has been growing and growing and growing, and it's time for him to act. And so he's ready to spring his secret. Let me change this thing, and we'll